Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Karen Dalton, and I'm running against Scott Perry in the Republican primary in the 10th Congressional District. I'd like to welcome you all to the first in-person session of what I call Scott Perry Therapy. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I see this country facing right now and a little bit about myself. So let me start by telling you why I'm running. We're in danger. We're in danger of losing our economic security, our national security, and our very way of life. We're also in danger of losing our moral and legal foundation, adherence to the Constitution and to the rule of law. And the threat is coming from within. I'm 65 years old. I've never before seen public officials act as Donald Trump, Scott Perry, and the rest of the Republicans in Congress act. Donald Trump acts like he's an invading force, damaging our country in almost every conceivable way. Scott Perry and the rest of the Republicans in Congress will not try to stop him. You don't need to be my age to agree that we've never before seen a president take a flamethrower to the economy. We've never seen a president deliberately drive up prices at the grocery store. No other president has deliberately taken away our families' health care. No other president has deliberately caused so much harm to our economy. No other president has deliberately caused tremors in the stock market or has so cavalierly steered us toward a recession. Some economists even warn that we're facing stagflation, which is a dangerous combination of high unemployment and high prices not seen since Jimmy Carter was president. The economic security we've come to rely upon is in jeopardy. I say with gratitude that the American people, including people in the mid-state, have joined together to form their own fire brigades. Neighbors and friends have banded together to try to put out the fire started by Donald Trump. They've grabbed buckets of water and fire hoses in the form of town halls, demonstrations, letters to the editor. You know who's not part of the fire brigade? Our own Scott Perry. Speaker Johnson and the rest of the deliberately and conveniently blind Republicans in Congress. Instead of working to put out the fire, Scott Perry is either acting as a cheerleader for the arsonist, Donald Trump, or is nowhere to be found. Penn Live reports that Scott Perry has not held an in-person town hall since 2019. He did hold a telephone town hall on April 2nd and another over the summer. When asked whether he supported the tariffs, which caused high unemployment and even higher prices, he said he did. When asked about the firing of our neighbors who work for the federal government, the 10th Congressional District has more federal workers than any other congressional district in Pennsylvania, Scott Perry said, "I wish DOJ would go further." I know Scott Perry made these statements because I was listening. Notice I didn't say I saw him face to face or eye to eye. I was listening through my phone. Scott Perry won't meet with us in person. He won't tolerate follow-up questions, and he won't tolerate debate. 3 days later, on April 5th, Scott Perry appeared in person at the Pennsylvania Leadership Conference in Camp Hill. Scott Perry won't meet with us in person, although he calls us his bosses, but he'll mingle with members of Newsmax and the American Spectator. Somehow, we don't rate an in-person appearance, but national far-right organizations do. At a union hall this past March in Harrisburg, a mom stood up and told how her son, who worked for the Department of Education, reviewing contracts, had been unjustifiably fired by Elon Musk and DOJ. They turned to Scott Perry for help, and Scott Perry wasn't there. Since Scott Perry doesn't seem to know or just doesn't seem to care that this congressional district has more federal workers than any other in the Commonwealth, I'll say it again. These are our neighbors, our friends, and they have families and mortgages and rental payments and children. Does Scott Perry realize that there are 66,000 federal workers in Pennsylvania, or does he just not care? Does Scott Perry know that when federal workers lose their jobs unjustifiably, it hurts not only the breadwinner, but the rest of the family? It strips the families of health insurance. It strips the breadwinner of dignity that only work brings. Or does he just not care? Does he care that many federal workers are veterans who just want to continue to serve? That the folks that work for the federal government that protect our food and medicine just want to serve? Does Scott Perry realize that firing federal workers for no reason hurts our economy? Or does he just not care? If Donald Trump was really serious about cutting waste, fraud, and abuse, then the president wouldn't have fired 17 inspectors general during his first week in office, including the ones, and here's a surprise, that were investigating Elon Musk. In addition, does Scott Perry realize that the cuts made by Elon Musk and Doge are causing our food and medicine not to be safe? Or does he just not care? The firings by Elon Musk and Doge hurt us all. Let me take a moment to talk about tariffs. Economists have told us that tariffs can be useful tools when applied in a targeted fashion, especially when it comes to China. But economists have also said that irrational across-the-board tariffs make no sense. They only serve to become a tax on the American people. They only serve to drive up prices. They only serve to make our supply lines much more fragile. Asked about tariffs at his April 2nd telephone town hall, Scott Perry said, "We need a level playing field in terms of trade." I have to wonder if Scott Perry realizes that the tariffs he champions alongside Donald Trump are really a sales tax, that they'll cause the average family thousands of dollars more in household items and food. Or does Scott Perry just not care? Does Scott Perry realize that companies, including a major auto manufacturer, cut jobs in response to the tariffs? Does Scott Perry know that since April, no less than 42,000 manufacturing jobs have been lost? Or does he just not care? That we've also lost jobs in the construction industry. Does Scott Perry know that for the first time since COVID, our economy during the first quarter of this year actually contracted? That the job numbers have to constantly be revised downward? Or does Scott Perry just not care? Does Scott Perry know that due to the tariff deal with the Japanese, the cost of a Japanese car is now cheaper than a Ford or a GM? That the cost of buying a house goes up because of the tariffs on lumber and copper? Does Scott Perry realize economists are now forecasting we're heading for a recession? That even the Wall Street Journal questions what the purpose of the tariffs are or what's supposed to happen because of them? Or does Scott Perry just not care? The chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, whom Donald Trump appointed, has told us that tariffs will cause prices to rise. I'll say this as plainly as I can in case Scott Perry is listening. Moms and dads need their jobs. Families need lower prices at the grocery store. Farmers who had to be bailed out during the first Trump term to the tune of $28 billion in taxpayer funds need stable markets in which to sell their crops. Because of the twin pressures of tariffs and cuts by Elon Musk and Doge, we're now watching our farmers watch their crops rot in the field or wonder where the record harvest will be sold. China is buying soybeans from South America instead of from the United States. Does Scott Perry know that the tariffs on steel have caused the prices of tractors and other farm equipment to soar? That fertilizer and other things that farmers need have now become much more expensive? That contracts written so that the farmers in our own mid-state could grow food for our own food banks have been canceled? The contracts to grow food for hungry people overseas also canceled? Or does he just not care? Does Scott Perry know that the Trump administration is currently considering whether to engage in a farmer's bailout 2.0? How does that help the economy or cut waste, fraud, and abuse? Nonsensical, across-the-board tariffs are a very definition of waste of taxpayer money and abuse of our families' ability to feed and clothe themselves. regarding tariffs, the hardest part for me to swallow is knowing that Scott Perry, Speaker Johnson, and the rest of the conveniently and deliberately blind Republicans have the power to take away Donald Trump's authority to set tariffs today, and that they could have put a stop to the damage done by Donald Trump yesterday, last week, last month, and months ago. They simply won't do it. As of October 11th, President Trump is threatening to impose an additional 100% tariff on China, and Beijing is threatening retaliatory measures. How will it help our families to be caught up in another useless trade war? Under the Constitution, only Congress can set tariffs. Again, let me say this clearly, just in case Scott Perry is listening. For a president to set tariffs, Congress must delegate its own authority. Since April 2nd, the president has relied upon the International Emergency Economic Powers Act as his authority to set tariffs. Under that statute, Congress can declare the emergency over at any time. They simply won't do it. They'd rather see people hurt than stand up to Donald Trump. And we are suffering because of their timidity. Now, as a second round of tariffs is being imposed, or not, we don't know what day of the week it is, what's the whim in Donald Trump's head, Congress won't have the ability to quickly take away the president's power. President Trump plans to act under another statute, one in which tariffs can be imposed due to national security. Donald Trump said he would impose a 100% tariff on medicine. Now, who can afford that? A 30% tariff on furniture and a 25% tariff on heavy trucks. I implore the people who took an oath to protect and defend the Constitution, and I'm speaking directly to you, Congressman Perry, to read it. I took an oath upon entering the legal profession to defend the Constitution of the United States. I take that oath very seriously. Based upon Scott Perry's behavior, it appears he doesn't take the Constitution seriously. If he did, he wouldn't be silent in the face of violation after violation on the part of the president. At a telephone town hall, Congressman Perry called himself a student of the Constitution. I'm telling Congressman Perry directly, based upon your public record, you must study the document harder. Let's look at Congressman Perry's public record regarding protecting and defending the Constitution. The right to vote is among the most sacred. It is one of the most important ways we make we the people real. During the 2020 election, Scott Perry tried to take away the votes of 6.7 million Pennsylvanians, including those who voted for Donald Trump. Specifically, he stood on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives on the morning of January 7th, mere hours after the blood of police officers had been spilled and our cathedral of democracy ransacked, so he could urge that Congress throw away the votes of 6.7 million Pennsylvanians. Additionally, Congressman Perry signed on to a lawsuit filed by the state of Texas to prevent the votes of 4 states from being counted, including ours. In contrast, our U.S. Senator, Pat Toomey, stood on the floor of the Senate and told the nation that the vote was legitimate. Congressman Perry has repeatedly said there have been no investigations into the votes he claims were stolen from Donald Trump during the 2020 race. So, in case Mr. Perry's listening, let me go through a list of the investigations, all of which said that voter fraud did not change the outcome. There were 60 lawsuits filed. Judges presiding over these lawsuits conducted investigation after investigation. By their nature, courts investigate allegations of lawbreaking. The job of a judge is to get at the truth. The lawyers for the Trump campaign, led by Rudy Giuliani and Jenna Ellis and Sidney Powell, have either lost their law licenses, been found liable in civil lawsuits brought by election workers, unjustly accused of fraud, or pled guilty to charges of interfering with a lawful election. William Barr, Donald Trump's own handpicked attorney general, sent FBI agents out across the country to track down each and every claim of voter fraud. Attorney General testified under oath before the January 6th committee that he sent the FBI agents out in order to find the truth. and if the FBI agents came back and said, we didn't find anything that would overturn the results, Mr. Barr wanted to be able to go to President Trump and say with full confidence, Mr. President, you lost the election. The Senate Judiciary Committee also conducted an investigation into the 2020 election. The committee found that there was a concerted effort by Donald Trump to try to overturn the results. Further, the committee went into excruciating detail about the efforts to appoint an attorney general who would pursue non-existent claims of voter fraud. The person who was almost appointed, Jeffrey Clark, was head of the department's civil division. In other words, he had no experience with criminal cases, and he wasn't qualified to be attorney general. Mr. Clark first came to the attention of the White House when Scott Perry brought him there. The two top lawyers at the Justice Department who took over once William Barr resigned, Jeffrey Rosen and Richard Donahue, testified before the January 6th committee regarding the actions of Congressman Perry as it related to Mr. Clark. Scott Perry, they testified, asked that Mr. Clark be allowed to conduct investigations into voter fraud. Further, Scott Perry claimed that Italian spy satellites had flipped votes somehow from Donald Trump to Joe Biden. Acting Deputy Attorney General Richard Donahue testified that this claim was, quote unquote, insane. Further, when Scott Perry asked to investigate so-called Italygate, the switching of votes by spy satellite, Acting Attorney General Jeffrey Rosen told Mr. Perry that there was no truth to this theory. Nevertheless, the January 6th committee released text messages between Congressman Perry and Chief of Staff to the President, Mark Meadows, in which Scott Perry asks, we can't work with the federal government? Why can't we just work with the federal government? See, that's so hard for me to say because it doesn't make any sense. Finally, Scott Perry sought the protection of a federal court when FBI agents, acting pursuant to a subpoena, seized his cell phone in order to look into his efforts to try to overturn the 2020 election. The federal judge in that case looked at the entirety of Mr. Perry's emails and text messages and decided only a small fraction should be protected by the speech and debate clause of the Constitution. The rest of them, the judge wrote, undercut Congressman Perry's claim that he was only conducting a fact-finding mission regarding voter fraud. Specifically, the judge wrote that Mr. Perry's efforts, and I'm going to quote the judge here, to overturn the election were protracted, persistent, and proactive. You might be asking yourself, how can actions taken by Mr. Perry 5 years ago be relevant to today? The answer is this. They're relevant to President Trump's efforts to overturn a free and fair election in 2026. Please remember that Deputy Attorney General Richard Donahue testified under oath that the President asked the Department of Justice to seize voting machines in 2020. The President is currently trying to amass enough power to federalize elections. Under the Constitution, states set the time, place, and manner of elections. But President Trump issued an executive order to make himself the vote counter in chief. The Department of Justice is asking states, including ours, to turn over private voting data. Further, Donald Trump urged states to more fully gerrymander already gerrymandered districts. States like Texas and Missouri, Utah, and Ohio have complied. As a lawyer, the most worrying action for me is sending federal troops into our cities under the President's control. Scott Perry has not uttered one word of opposition to the President sending troops into our cities or governors sending their own states into different states. And I asked Scott Perry, would he say anything or would he remain silent if the governor of Texas sent troops to Harrisburg? I know I wouldn't if I was the congressperson from this district. My fear is that Donald Trump is grooming the American people so they become comfortable with troops in the streets, so that troops can be in the streets on Election Day 2026. Please also remember that Donald Trump has urged that a voting official in Colorado, Tina Peters, who was sentenced to 9 years in prison for tampering with voting data, be released. President Trump is being on record as not being concerned with the tampering of voting machines and he's on record as trying to get the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security to seize voting machines in 2020. I sincerely hope my fear is unfounded, that federal troops will not be on the street on Election Day. At the same time, I've got to be a realist, and I must recognize the facts as we all see them. The history of Donald Trump and Scott Perry when it comes to trying to overturn a lawful election. I'm afraid that troops will be directed by Donald Trump to seize voting machines. I'm also afraid that given Scott Perry's history of not standing up for our right to vote, as well as his history of trying to overturn a free and fair election, that Scott Perry will help Donald Trump once again try to steal a free and fair election in 2026. Looking more closely at Mr. Perry's recent efforts to win re-election, I'm afraid that if he loses in November, he probably will not accept the results, and that he will welcome the seizure of voting machines. I sincerely hope I'm proven wrong. I've never wanted to be wrong about anything more in my life. But if I lose in November or in May, I'll concede. I'm afraid that that will not be the case with Scott Perry. As news reports indicate, Mr. Perry has started to sow doubts about the security of mail-in ballots. At an appearance in New York during the summer, Congressman Perry acknowledged that states set the time, place, and manner of elections, but he said he would prefer voting only on Election Day and only in person, not with this tricky mail-in ballot stuff. Again, just in case Mr. Perry is listening, I want to assure him and everyone here that mail-in voting is safe and secure. Pennsylvania has had some type of mail-in ballots since the 1960s. When the General Assembly enacted the statute to permit universal mail-in voting in 2019, it was done on a bipartisan basis. In fact, the majority leader in the Pennsylvania House at the time, Brian Cutler, a Republican, urged the Commonwealth to adopt mail-in voting. And I'm going to quote him here, because mail-in voting, quote, serves to preserve the integrity of every election and lift the voice of every voter in Pennsylvania, unquote. This is the same Brian Cutler who, as Speaker of the Pennsylvania House, told President Trump that the General Assembly had no authority to overturn the election results in 2020. Finally, the Supreme Court reviewed the legality of mail-in voting under the Pennsylvania Constitution. The law was upheld. Among the statements Scott Perry has made, whether they be about mail-in voting or voter fraud, the ones that worry me the most are the ones in which Scott Perry says he's in favor of federal troops conducting law enforcement operations, including making arrests. I have read of times in the past when troops have helped local police, but those troops helped with logistics and communications, and so were inside police headquarters. They weren't tasked with actually making arrests, and they didn't dress as if they were ready to go to war with the American people. Let me be clear, I'm against crime. I favor increasing federal law enforcement dollars to hire more police officers and to beef up training. But I'm against troops under the direction of the president being used to harass or intimidate voters on Election Day or any other day. The military is trained to be lethal. Police officers are trained to protect and serve. Because I am so afraid that Scott Perry will not honor the results of the election in November if he loses, I am asking all voters in the 10th Congressional District who call themselves independents, all 77,000 of you, to consider registering as Republicans and voting for me in the primary. I am asking the same thing of Democrats in the 10th, who would be happy to support whoever wins the Democratic primary. If we wait until November to defeat Scott Perry, I'm afraid it will be too late. I do not mean to sound alarmist or to accuse Mr. Perry of lawlessness ahead of the election. I'm simply raising the issue based upon Mr. Perry's prior history, his statements raising doubts about mail-in voting, and his support of everything Donald Trump does, including sending troops into our streets. Please allow me to tell you a little bit about myself so you can consider whether to give me permission to represent you in Congress. I've been a Republican since 1984. That's over 40 years. I've been a Republican so long I can say with great pride, I was a Republican when Donald Trump was a Democrat. Before I graduated from the Dickinson School of Law in 1993, I was campaign manager for then State Representative Jim Greenwood of Bucks County. I came to Pennsylvania for the first time to work for Jim to help him get elected to the state Senate. As you know, Jim Greenwood went on to serve with distinction in Congress. I'll never forget watching him on TV leading the investigation into Enron. He was asked by a national reporter how his Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee could look at the facts of the Enron investigation when he took PAC money. Jim looked at the reporter in the eye and said, "I don't take PAC money." It is because of Jim's example that this campaign will not take a dime of PAC money. Before that, I worked in government and politics in New Jersey, always for Republicans. My first campaign was for a Republican state Senate candidate in New Jersey in the town in which I lived. I went on to serve as a press secretary and speechwriter for Governor Tom Kean of New Jersey, also a Republican. That was for the Commissioner of Banking. Governor Kean spoke of helping every New Jerseyan through his politics of inclusion. Governor Kean worked to protect the environment as well as build infrastructure. The economy of New Jersey took off, and he won every city, including Newark and Camden, when he ran for re-election. Before I retired in 2020, I spent over 25 years as a staff attorney for the House Republican Caucus in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives, that wing of this beautiful building right over there. As a staff attorney, I saw principled Republican leadership on a daily basis, not only on the part of our leaders, like Speaker Matt Ryan, but on the part of the chairs of the Judiciary Committee, under whom I served. I spent over 20 years as counsel to the House Judiciary Committee. I drafted and helped to pass legislation designed to help victims of domestic violence and sexual violence, especially children. Having seen the pain of victims up close, I know that when government creates more pain in people's lives, like we see now happening on the part of Congressman Perry and Donald Trump, something is desperately wrong. I do not say this lightly. We need to defeat Scott Perry in the primary. We cannot afford to wait until November. I'm a centrist, a Republican from the moderate Main Street wing. I believe in the sensible center. I believe government should only be as big as it needs to be to help people live more secure and prosperous lives. While I am cautious of overregulation, I also believe there's a role for government to play with respect to helping people climb the economic ladder of opportunity and help people achieve their dreams. We just have to be smart about it and put in place public policy that works. Seeing how the work of the Republicans in the Pennsylvania House made such a difference in the lives of victims, I also believe part of government's job is to help people heal. I saw that in this very building, working for the chairs of the Judiciary Committee, the Republican members, and leadership. These were the Republican leaders who made sure that shelters for victims of domestic violence and their children were funded, that found a way to add additional children's advocacy centers, and that enacted legislation to allow victims of rape to require the rapist to undergo a test for HIV/AIDS. Not only did that legislation give victims a peace of mind, it enabled Pennsylvania to draw down more federal dollars. I mentioned before, I'm 65 years old. I'm not a professional politician. And Scott Perry is. In fact, I know Scott Perry, both because we served in the Pennsylvania House at the same time. He is a staff member. He has a member and I a staff. I prayed for Congressman Perry's safety when he was deployed to Iraq while serving in the State House. He was always so kind to me personally. So my decision to run against him in the primary is not personal. This campaign is about Congressman Perry's failure to understand the covenant between the representative and the voters, and about giving voters a choice to replace him with someone who does understand that covenant. In sum, Scott Perry's votes, his public statements, and his support for everything Donald Trump does at our expense compel me to challenge him in the primary. I am familiar with Ronald Reagan's famous statement, "Thou shalt not speak ill of any fellow Republican." If we were in the midst of normal times, I would agree. But we are not in normal times. One of our faith leaders, Rabbi Sharon Brous, had said, "When the heart calluses to cruelty, we must periodically suspend the normal." I believe it is time to suspend the normal. That is why I'm running against Scott Perry in the Republican primary, and why I'm asking Republicans, independents, and Democrats to join with me in this effort. There is simply too much at stake in this race, both how we live today and in the future. Let me be as clear as I can. I don't accuse Scott Perry of being a bad or evil person. To my mind, Congressman Perry is deliberately and conveniently blind to the harm he causes through his votes and by following Donald Trump's disastrous and fantasy-based behavior, which somehow manages to masquerade as public policy. And because Scott Perry is deliberately and conveniently blind to the harm caused by Donald Trump, Mr. Perry is also morally blind. So is every Republican member in Congress who follows Donald Trump, blind to the suffering of the rest of us. That is why I'm asking not only Republicans to vote for me in the primary, I'm asking independents and Democrats to join me in working to defeat Scott Perry in May of 2026, a full 5 months before the general election. If you register as a Republican, you can vote in the Republican primary, and you can always switch back. And choosing a party has no bearing on who you vote for in the general election. As voters decide whom they will support, I want them to know where I stand. I want to start with the inappropriately named One Big Beautiful Bill. I believe its provisions are so harmful to the American people that it should be called the Big Brutal Betrayal of the American Dream Act. Scott Perry was the deciding vote in the House of Representatives. He could have voted no or asked for changes. He said he was concerned with the deficit. He wrote that on X, yes, yet he voted for it not once but twice. Some Republican members of Congress did ask for changes, like Mike Lawler of New York, and the Republican leadership in Congress obliged. There simply isn't enough time to go into all the ways in which the big, brutal betrayal of the American Dream Act will make our nation weaker. The bill will make sick people sicker, hungry people hungrier, and close the doors to higher education to those that can't afford to pay for it themselves. The health care cuts are not only to Medicaid, but to also those under the Affordable Care Act. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that 15 million people will be thrown off their health insurance. The big, brutal betrayal of the American Dream Act is currently at the center of the government shutdown. The fight is over restoring the cuts to Medicaid and to the Affordable Care Act made by Scott Perry and the other morally blind Republicans in Congress. As of Friday, October 10th, Donald Trump has started firing more federal workers. Under federal law, workers that are furloughed during a shutdown are given back pay when the shutdown is over. Firing federal workers is not only illegal, it's immoral. Why punish workers for the shutdown? They're blameless. The American people depend upon federal workers to protect them. Among those fired were those engaged in cybersecurity inside the Department of Homeland Security, scientists employed by the CDC, and professionals employed by the Department of Justice. Also fired were employees of the Department of Education, of Housing and Urban Development, and the Environmental Protection Agency. How do these firings make the country safer or help our economy? As I said before, stripping a breadwinner of dignity hurts us all. Does Scott Perry not know this, or does he simply not care? Why isn't he telling Donald Trump not to punish these public servants? I know I would if I represented the 10th. What has Scott Perry done to try to save our health insurance and get the government reopened? Nothing. Instead, Scott Perry has decided to forego his salary. I say this respectfully, but you cannot compare the salary of a member of Congress, $174,000 a year, or the financial circumstances of a member of Congress, with the salary or circumstances of a janitor, a cook, or a staffer at a federal agency. This is a meaningless act and does nothing to to save health insurance or get the government reopened. Why doesn't Scott Perry see this? Or does he just not care? Back to the big, brutal betrayal of the American Dream Act. Why didn't Scott Perry see the harm that passage of this bill would cause? Or does he just not care? The Republican leadership in Congress must have, because they pushed the effective dates of the worst parts of it off until after the midterm elections in 2026. In other words, the most draconian effects will only kick in once Scott Perry and the other morally blind Republicans in Congress are safely re-elected, or so they hope. But Congress did not put off the tax giveaways given to the wealthiest corporations or individuals among us, the top 1%. The Congressional Budget Office has told us we will have record deficit and debt as much as $5 trillion. And for what? To fund tax cuts to the wealthiest among us. What if you're not at the top? Your tax cut will be minuscule. The top tax cut for an individual is expected to be about $64,000 a year. Meanwhile, back home here in the 10th Congressional District, the per capita income is only $43,000 a year. How is that fair? Those at the bottom of the economic ladder, making under $27,000, will see a tax cut of under $2 a week. How does that buy gas or groceries? The people making over $27,000 a year, but under $53,000 a year, will see a tax savings of about $14 a week. In Donald Trump's and Scott Perry's economy, what does that really buy? The people in the middle, making between $53,000 and $92,000 a year, will see a tax cut of about $1,600 a year, or $30 a week. That's not enough to fill your gas tank or take your family out for a nice dinner on a Friday night. Does Scott Perry know this, or does he just not care? Here's what I'm for. It goes without saying that if the voters of this district give me permission to represent them in Congress, I will do all I can to repeal the draconian cuts under the big, brutal betrayal of the American Dream Act. But I promise I will do more. Go to my website, votekd4c.com, and you'll see my platform called Fulfilling America's Promise to Our Families. The website sets forth my plans for rebuilding and restoring our nation. I believe we must do all we can to make the American dream real for each and every family. We must build a future we all want to see. That means rebuilding the country and restoring what is being lost due to the morally blind Republicans in Congress, including Scott Perry, following Donald Trump mindlessly instead of listening to the cries for help from our families. Again, if you go to votekd4c.com, you will see my economic policies. They are meant to increase the buying power of our families. For example, let's increase the child tax credit. Let's get it to a level that'll really help. I would provide a tax credit of $5,000 for each child under age 5, and I would also provide a tax credit of $4,000 for each child 6 and up. And I would keep that tax credit while a child is still attending high school, even if they're 18 years old. Let's allow families to deduct 100% of child care expenses. The big, brutal betrayal of the American Dream Act only permits families to deduct 50%. Additionally, the big, brutal betrayal of the American Dream Act will throw off many families from the child tax credit who at one time qualified. This is simply wrong. It's wrong for our families, and it's wrong for our economy. We can cut the deficit in a responsible way by making sure that wealthy corporations and the wealthiest individuals pay their fair share. They've reaped the best and greatest economic benefits. They can afford to pay a little more. For example, we can close the loophole that allows hedge fund managers to have their incomes taxed at 2 different rates, the so-called carried interest loophole. It's estimated that closing that loophole will raise $12 billion over 10 years. Let me just briefly outline 3 proposals which will help rebuild our country. The first is a Social Security loan program called Make Social Security Work for Us Now. Research shows that most young adults don't think they'll ever be able to collect Social Security, but they're paying into the system right now. The loan program would permit anyone under 62 to borrow up to 2 years' worth of Social Security benefits about $40,000, and pay it back a little at a time when they're collecting their Social Security check. Just let us deduct a little bit from your check each month. Use the money for any family-related need, like making a down payment on a house, starting a business, paying for college, making rent, and the like. Imagine how that money would fuel not only the economy, but the dreams of a family. And as the money is repaid, it would stabilize the Social Security fund. The second policy I would implement is aimed at making higher education available to everyone who can do college-level work. I believe that we not only have to have an educated workforce, we must commit to helping people, especially young people, achieve their dreams. Money, or lack of it, cannot stand between a student and their education. They must take their rightful place in our economy and in the American dream. Unlike the big, brutal betrayal of the American Dream Act, I do not think the government should tell students who need to take out loans that their dreams don't count. I know this firsthand. It took me 19 years to pay off my law school loans. I would implement Serve America scholarships. The federal government will pay for college, community college, graduate school, or professional school. Just commit to working in the public service upon graduation. If you want to be a doctor or a nurse, great, we'll pay. Just work at a veterans hospital, a public health clinic, or another public health agency for 10 years. You want to get a job as a lawyer? Great. Just work as a public defender or district attorney or a lawyer representing abused children or victims of domestic violence before our courts. You want to study music? Great. Just become a music therapist at a hospital. The sky's the limit on the number of lives lifted and the economic activity the program will generate. Imagine the shortage of doctors and nurses and other healthcare providers vanishing over time. Imagine a legal system that has enough lawyers to help families facing eviction and to represent families undergoing breakup if they can't afford one themselves. The third idea is designed to make America the leader in science once again. Donald Trump and Scott Perry and the other morally blind Republicans have held up or cut money earmarked for scientific research. Grants to conduct research, which leads to new drugs and treatments, have been withheld. I believe this is beyond reckless. It's simply cruel. It doesn't help us be a healthier country. It doesn't help sick people who are waiting for a cure. The truth is, the world runs on the things that America discovers and creates. We're in a race with China in terms of science in general, and artificial intelligence in particular. Failing in our race with China will have huge consequences, and not just economically. I would create a national foundation for scientific discovery. The idea is to identify students who love science and want to make a career out of it, and pay for their schooling and then get them jobs. Just work in the newly created National Foundation for Scientific Discovery, or another of America's premier scientific agencies, like the NIH or the CDC. Imagine what the future would look like, preventing the next pandemic, finding a cure for diseases that plague mankind, finding a way to fuel data centers, which does not rely upon nuclear energy or threaten the power grid or the water supply, finding a way to use plastic so it doesn't harm the environment or us. There are no limits to what we as a country could create. The power to change things lies in our own hands. It lies in our ballots, it lies in our determination, it lies in our hearts. We have the power to remove Scott Perry for Congress. We have the power to choose to have someone else represent us. As you said before, if I lose, I will concede. If I should gain the voters' permission to represent them in Washington, I will only serve 3 terms. I will hold regular, in-person town halls. I believe that meeting face-to-face is so important. I will hold my first town hall as a candidate in November. Please go to my website, votekd4c.com, for details. I promise, if you elect me, I won't forget who sent me or why I'm there. America has faced tough times before. Our grandparents fought World War II and lived through the Great Depression. Our ancestors freed us from a tyrannical king. firing the first shots of the American Revolution at Lexington and Concord. Current generations invented the computer chip, which revolutionized everyday life. We are the inheritors of a great and majestic legacy of constitutional democracy, of an ethos that says that we, as Americans, are one another's keepers, of being a generous and decent people, defenders of democracy abroad, and of equal opportunity and freedom of the individual at home. We can rebuild, we can restore. As my faith teaches me, when the temple is destroyed, you go to work rebuilding that temple. Primary day and then election day in 2026 is not that far away. I ask my neighbors to please consider voting for me in the primary, Republicans, independents, and those Democrats who are happy with all of their candidates. Together, we can reach a day when Scott Perry is in the rear view mirror. We can reach a day when we send a representative to Washington who will be independent of Donald Trump, who will listen with her heart as well as her ears, who will put your interests front and center, not Donald Trump's, who will honor the Constitution and the rule of law. I'm Karen Dalton, an independent Republican, a Republican with a heart, a Republican you can trust.